The air in Ethelgard was thick with the scent of money, a complex bouquet of aged leather, truffle oil, and the faint, metallic tang of ambition. To Alara Vance, it was a soundscape more than anything else. She moved through the dining room, not with her eyes, but with her ears, navigating a world painted in acoustics. The gentle clinking of silver against porcelain was the room's baseline rhythm, the hushed murmur of billion-dollar deals, a constant, low hum. Her uniform, a simple, tailored black dress, was a cloak of invisibility, designed to make her blend into the opulent shadows cast by chandeliers that hung like frozen constellations. She was efficient, precise, a ghost who refilled water glasses and cleared plates with an unnerving silence that the patrons mistook for simple servitude. Inside, however, behind the blank, professional mask she wore, Alara was anything but simple. Her mind was a courtroom, and every sound in this gilded cage was evidence. The slight tremor in a CEO's voice as he denied a rumor, the overly boisterous laugh of a man bluffing his way through a negotiation, she collected these sonic tells, filing them away with the meticulous discipline her law school training had ingrained in her. She was a silent archivist of the truths hidden beneath the surface of wealth, a keeper of secrets she never intended to use. Her motivation was a sound too, a constant rasping melody of labored breathing that haunted her waking moments and echoed in her dreams. It was the sound of her father, a man who once had a laugh that could shake a room, now confined to a small apartment, tethered to an oxygen machine that hissed and clicked day and night. The memory of the day her world went dark was not a visual one. It was a sound, a deep, earth-shattering roar that tore through the sky, followed by a chemical silence that smelled of burning plastic and shattered futures. The explosion at the chemical plant, a subsidiary of a corporate behemoth, had stolen her sight and poisoned her father's lungs, replacing his laughter with a permanent, debilitating cough. It had forced her to abandon her dream of becoming a lawyer, trading casebooks and mock trials for serving trays and feigned deference. Every dollar she earned in this temple of excess, every condescending glance she endured, was transmuted into another week of medication, another payment on the mountain of medical debt that was their new reality. This wasn't just a job, it was a penance, a silent, daily battle to keep the one person she had left in the world breathing. Her blindness had not been a curse but a crucible. When the world of light was extinguished, the world of sound bloomed in its place with an almost painful intensity. Her hearing, already sharp, had evolved into something more. It was a forensic tool. She could hear the subtle shift in a person's heart rate through the vibration in their chest cavity when they spoke, the minuscule contraction of a throat muscle before a lie was uttered, the almost imperceptible intake of breath that signaled deception. Combined with the skills she had honed in law school, learning to dismantle testimonies and read witnesses, she had become a human polygraph. She could hear the architecture of a lie, the hollow spaces and weak foundations hidden within a carefully constructed sentence. The patrons of Ethelgard saw a blind waitress, an object of pity or a piece of furniture to be ignored. They had no idea that the woman refilling their champagne was listening to their souls, discerning truth from falsehood with a clarity that sight could never offer. Her blindness was her shield and her weapon, a secret power forged in the very fire that was meant to destroy her. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The delicate symphony of the dining room was shattered by a new sound, a presence that was less an entrance and more a conquest. Sterling Blackwood did not walk into Ethelgard, he consumed it. The ambient murmur of the room faltered, conversations dipping as heads turned. Alara didn't need to see him to know him. She heard the sound of his handmade Italian leather shoes on the marble floor, each step a declaration of ownership. She heard the maitre d's voice shift into a higher, more obsequious register, the professional courtesy replaced with palpable fear. She heard the air itself seem to part for him, a wave of deference rippling through the room. He was a gravitational anomaly, pulling all light and attention toward himself, leaving a wake of nervous energy. He was accompanied by two other men, their footsteps softer, less certain. The steps of satellites caught in the orbit of a dying star. They were the investors, she surmised, the flies he was luring into his web tonight. Alara remained perfectly still near her station, her head slightly tilted, listening to the story of his arrival unfold. As they were led to the best table in the house, a secluded corner booth that offered both privacy and a commanding view of the entire establishment, Alara's senses were flooded with data. She heard the quiet scrape of the chair as Sterling sat, a sound of impatient finality. He didn't look at the wine list the sommelier presented. He simply named a vintage, a 1982 Chateau Margaux, a bottle that cost more than her father's medical bills for 3 months. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and polished like riverstone, but underneath it, she heard a grating arrogance, a texture of utter contempt for everything and everyone around him. The laughter of his guests was thin, brittle, the sound of men trying too hard to please a predator. Ilara's hand tightened for a fraction of a second on the linen cloth she was holding. She had served countless powerful men, had listened to their casual cruelties and hollow boasts, but this one was different. His arrogance had a frequency that resonated with something dark and familiar within her, a discordant note that vibrated with the memory of loss. She took a slow, calming breath and began to move toward his table, her steps silent, her purpose clear, to be invisible. The conversation was a masterclass in corporate seduction. Sterling spoke of a new green energy venture, a fraudulent enterprise Ilara's hearing immediately identified as a shell game of buzzwords and empty promises. He used words like synergy, sustainability, and disruption, but his voice lacked the resonant frequency of genuine belief. It was hollow, a performance piece designed to dazzle and deceive. He was selling a fantasy, and his investors were consuming it like the overpriced wine he had ordered. Ilara moved around the table with practiced grace, refilling water glasses, her presence meant to be no more significant than a breeze. Yet she was listening to every word, every subtle inflection. She heard the faint, almost imperceptible sigh from one of the investors, a sound of capitulation. He was winning them over. The deal was closing, right here, over seared scallops and feigned sincerity. The quiet fury that lived in her stomach, the one she kept tightly coiled and suppressed, began to stir. She recognized this brand of predatory charm. It was the same smiling, confident deceit that had signed the memos slashing safety budgets at her father's plant. Then, the performance shifted. Sterling leaned back in the booth, the leather groaning under his weight, and a smirk entered his voice. He was about to deliver his closing argument. To seal the deal, he needed to appear not just brilliant, but trustworthy, a man of the people. He raised his voice slightly, a calculated change in volume designed to draw in the periphery, to make his private conversation a public spectacle. He was now performing for the room, but most specifically, for her. He had noticed her, the blind waitress, and in his mind, she was the perfect prop. What better audience for a tale of struggle and triumph than a broken, sightless servant? He cleared his throat, a theatrical sound that commanded the silence of his table, and began to spin his web. He started speaking of his impoverished childhood, a narrative so worn and polished from retelling that it shone with the false light of a cheap gemstone. He was using her perceived weakness and invisibility, as a backdrop for his lies, assuming she was nothing more than an unperceiving witness to his carefully crafted fiction. The moment he began to speak of his fabricated past, Alara's world split in two. On the surface, she was the perfect waitress, her movements fluid and economical as she placed a fresh basket of bread on the table. Her expression was neutral, her posture deferential, but inside a storm was gathering. Her hearing, laser-focused, latched onto his voice, dissecting it syllable by syllable. He said the word honest, and the pitch rose by a quarter tone on the second syllable, a classic tell of fabrication, an unconscious vocal tick of someone trying to convince themselves as much as their audience. A cold, sharp memory pierced through the fog of her professional composure. the face of a company spokesman on television, years ago, using that same rising inflection as he promised a, quote, full and honest investigation into the explosion. The lie was a physical thing, an acrid taste at the back of her throat. Sterling was not just telling a story. He was desecrating the very concept of struggle, a reality her family lived every single day. He continued, his voice dripping with synthetic emotion as he described his sick mother and the sacrifices he had to make. As he uttered the word mother, his breathing hitched for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of the voice that screamed deceit. The sound, imperceptible to anyone else, was a thunderclap in Ilara's ears. It was the sound of a man who held nothing sacred. The image of her own father, his body frail and his face etched with pain, flashed behind her eyes. The quiet dignity with which he faced his slow, chemically induced decline stood in stark, blinding contrast to the cheap, exploitative fiction spilling from Sterling Blackwood's lips. A fury unlike anything she had ever felt began to solidify in her veins. It wasn't hot or chaotic. It was a cold, dense rage, a block of ice forming around her heart, steadying her hands and slowing her breath. He thought she was a prop. He thought she was deaf to the truth. He was about to learn that the people you deem invisible are the ones who see everything. The silence that followed his story was a living thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the clinking of silverware and the murmur of distant conversations. It was a vacuum, and into that vacuum every ear in the vicinity was pulled. The two investors seated across from Sterling Blackwood were rapt, their faces a mixture of manufactured sympathy and genuine admiration. They had bought the performance, hook, line, and sinker. But Ilara heard something else. She heard the lie hanging in the air, a dissonant chord in the room's symphony. Inside her, the cold fury that had been slowly crystallizing reached its final, perfect state. It was no longer a chaotic emotion. It was a tool, a lens of absolute clarity. Her heart rate, which had been a frantic drum against her ribs, slowed to a steady, resolute rhythm. She was no longer a waitress. She was a witness on the stand, and the prosecution was about to begin. She felt the subtle shift of air currents as heads turned, the collective intake of breath from nearby tables. The stage was set, not by Sterling, but by the truth he had so carelessly desecrated. Her first movement was an act of profound, deliberate theater. She reached for the empty water pitcher on her service tray, her fingers closing around the cool, smooth handle. Every person at the table, and several beyond it, watched her. She moved towards Sterling's glass, her steps so silent on the thick Persian rug that her presence was felt rather than heard. She did not pour. Instead, with a steadiness that seemed to defy the tension in the air, she gently placed the crystal pitcher on the white linen tablecloth. The sound it made was not loud, but it was definitive. A single, clear note, like a judge's gavel striking wood, a sound that cut through the silence and claimed it as her own. It was a declaration. The act of a servant was complete, and something new was about to begin. She could hear the faint, confused rustle of one investor's suit jacket, the almost imperceptible scrape of a chair as the other leaned forward, intrigued. Sterling himself remained perfectly still, a smug, self-satisfied smile still playing on his lips, utterly oblivious to the fact that his world was balanced on the edge of a knife. Then she turned her head. It was not a full turn, but a slight, precise inclination in his direction, an angle she had perfected to aim her hearing like a weapon. Her posture shifted. The subtle slump of the service worker, the slight curve of the spine designed to convey deference and invisibility, straightened. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. It was a transformation so complete, it was as if she had shed a physical skin. In that moment, she was no longer Ilara Vance, the waitress. She was Ilara Vance, top of her class, the prodigy of the law school mock trial team, a woman who could dismantle a hostile witness without raising her voice. Her mind raced, not with fear, but with legal precedent and the cold, hard facts of human deception she had studied for years. The image of her father, his chest rattling with each breath, was a fire in her mind's eye, a furnace that forged her resolve into something unbreakable. She was not just defending her own dignity, she was defending his. She was defending every person who had ever been crushed under the heel of men like this. Her voice, when it came, was the antithesis of the room's opulent warmth. It was cool, clear, and carried the weight of absolute certainty. It was not loud, yet it commanded the attention of everyone within earshot, silencing the few remaining whispers. "Mr. Blackwood, I may be blind, but I can hear a lie." The words were not an accusation. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon making an incision. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The smug smile on Sterling's face froze, then cracked, like a porcelain mask dropped on a marble floor. The investors' eyes widened, their heads snapping back and forth between Sterling and the blind waitress who had just spoken heresy. A wave of audible gasps rippled through the nearby tables. Ilara could hear the sudden, sharp intake of breath from the maitre d' across the room, a sound of pure panic. She had shattered the unspoken contract of this place. The staff were to be invisible, silent, and complicit in the fantasies of the wealthy. She had just proven she was none of those things. She did not give him time to recover, to build his defenses or summon his rage. She pressed her advantage, her voice remaining level, a clinical instrument of dissection. You see, when a person tells the truth, their vocal cords vibrate with a consistent, resonant frequency. It's a baseline of authenticity. Your baseline, Mr. Blackwood, is remarkably stable when you speak of profit margins and market projections, but it becomes erratic when you speak of people. Her words were a masterclass in showing, not telling. She wasn't just calling him a liar. She was explaining the methodology of her detection, lending an undeniable weight of expertise to her claim. She could hear the frantic thumping of Sterling's heart begin to accelerate, a rapid, panic staccato that was a confession all its own. The blood was draining from his face. She could hear the subtle change in blood pressure in the veins of his neck, a faint, high-pitched whoosh that his body could not conceal. He was trapped, exposed by a sense he had never bothered to consider. She continued, her focus narrowing on the most egregious part of his performance. When you spoke of your impoverished childhood, your cadence was flawless, a well-rehearsed script. But when you mentioned your sick mother, your breathing hitched for a mere 1/8 of a second, just before the word mother. It's an involuntary tell, a micro-expression of the voice that occurs when the brain is actively fabricating an emotional connection it does not feel. The two investors leaned away from Sterling, a subtle, unconscious physical distancing that spoke volumes. They were no longer just suspicious. They were witnessing a vivisection. Ilara's mind flashed again to her own reality, to the countless nights she had sat by her father's bedside, listening to the very real, very painful hitch in his breathing, a sound of genuine suffering. The contrast between that sacred reality and Sterling's cheap, manipulative fiction was a chasm, and she was dragging him into it for all to see. She was turning his weapon of performance art against him, using her heightened senses to reveal the rotten foundation beneath his polished facade. And then she delivered the final killing blow, connecting his lie to a wound he could not possibly have known he was touching. "The word honest," she said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in closer. "When you claimed to have built your empire through honest work, the pitch of your voice rose by a quarter tone on the second syllable. It's the same vocal tick I heard years ago, from a spokesman on a television screen, a man from a chemical company who promised a full and honest investigation into an explosion that destroyed my family. He was lying then, and you, Mr. Blackwood, are lying now." The personal connection, the raw, undeniable pain in that statement, landed with the force of a physical blow. It elevated her from a clever observer to a victim with a righteous cause. The investors now looked at Sterling with something approaching disgust. He was no longer just a liar, he was a ghoul, a man who would feign the very sort of tragedy he himself had likely caused in his relentless pursuit of profit. The silence in the restaurant was now absolute, a tomb of his own making. For a long moment, Sterling Blackwood was incapable of speech. His entire being, an edifice built on the foundations of control, intimidation, and perception, was crumbling. Ilara could hear the grinding of his teeth, a faint, gritty sound of immense pressure. The smooth, confident baritone was gone, and when he finally found his voice, it was a strangled, venomous hiss, barely above a whisper, but more menacing than any shout. The charm evaporated, revealing the ugly, reptilian creature beneath. He did not look at her. To do so would be to acknowledge her as an equal, as the one who had bested him. Instead, he locked his furious gaze on his investors, then slowly turned his head toward the maître d'hôtel, who was already rushing toward the table, his face ashen. "Get her out of here," Sterling seethed, the words tight and clipped, each one a shard of glass. Now. He didn't need to raise his voice. The quiet, concentrated fury was a promise of annihilation, a threat to burn the entire establishment to the ground if his will was not immediately obeyed. The maître d', a man named Jean-Pierre who had always treated Ilara with a distant professional kindness, looked at her with eyes full of panic and a flicker of genuine regret. He was trapped, a pawn in a game far above his station. His loyalty was to the restaurant, to its reputation, and Sterling Blackwood was a man who could shatter that reputation with a single phone call. "I'm so sorry, Ilara," he murmured, his own voice strained, avoiding her gaze. "Please, come with me." He gestured for two security guards who had been standing discreetly by the entrance. The investors at the table began to make their excuses. A flurry of uncomfortable murmurs about needing to leave, about an early morning. The deal was dead. Ilara could hear it in the finality of their tones, the scraping of their chairs as they stood to flee the toxic fallout of Sterling's public implosion. She had not only exposed a lie, she had cost him millions. She offered no resistance. She allowed Jean-Pierre to gently take her arm, her dignity, a silent, impenetrable shield around her. As she was escorted from the dining room, she moved through a sea of whispers and stares. She could feel the heat of their gazes, a mixture of pity, shock, and for some, a spark of admiration. She kept her head held high, her senses cataloging the aftermath of the bomb she had detonated. She heard Sterling's strained, furious breathing behind her. She heard the nervous apologies of Jean-Pierre. She heard the squeak of the security guards, leather shoes on the marble floor. She was being cast out, fired, her livelihood stripped away in an instant. But as she walked, she did not feel defeated. She felt a strange sense of liberation. For years, she had been a ghost, a silent observer in the temple of her enemies. Tonight, for the first time since the explosion, she had spoken. She had found her voice, and it was more powerful than she had ever imagined. The heavy oak doors of Æthelgard closed behind her with a soft, final thud, shutting out the world of contrived opulence and leaving her on the cold, wind-swept pavement of a New York City evening. The sudden shock of the cool night air was a slap in the face, bringing the full weight of her actions crashing down upon her. The sounds of the city, which were usually a complex but familiar symphony, now felt jarring and hostile. The blare of a taxi horn, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a subway train beneath her feet. Each sound was a reminder of her new precarious reality. She was jobless. The steady income that paid for her father's oxygen tanks, his medication, his food, was gone. A wave of pure, cold panic washed over her, so intense it made her knees feel weak. "What have I done?" The question echoed in the sudden emptiness of her future. She had won a moral victory, but morality didn't pay rent. The journey home on the subway was an exercise in sensory overload and crushing anxiety. The screech of the train's wheels against the tracks, the cacophony of a dozen simultaneous conversations in languages she didn't understand, the tinny beat leaking from a teenager's headphones, it all pressed in on her. Each sound seemed to mock her, a chorus of judgment for her recklessness. She clutched her worn handbag to her chest, the thin fabric, a poor defense against the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She thought of her father, waiting for her in their small, quiet apartment. How could she face him? How could she tell him that she had thrown away their only lifeline for a moment of righteous indignation? The weight of her responsibility felt like a physical pressure, a hand squeezing her heart until she could barely breathe. The triumph she had felt in the restaurant had evaporated, leaving behind only the bitter dregs of fear and regret. When she finally unlocked the door to their apartment, the familiar scent of old books and antiseptic cleaner did little to soothe her frayed nerves. The first and most prominent sound was, as always, the rhythmic hiss and click of the oxygen concentrator in the corner of the living room. It was the soundtrack of their lives, a constant reminder of what they had lost and what she was fighting to preserve. Her father was asleep in his armchair, a worn blanket pulled up to his chin, his chest rising and falling in a shallow, labored rhythm. Seeing him like that, so frail and vulnerable, a fresh wave of guilt washed over her. He looked peaceful, blissfully unaware that the fragile stability she had worked so hard to build had just been shattered. She stood in the doorway for a long time, listening to him breathe, the sound both a comfort and an accusation. She had acted out of love for him, to defend his honor, but the consequences of that act now threatened his very existence. She sank onto the edge of her own bed in the small adjacent room, the old mattress springs groaning in protest. The silence of the apartment, punctuated only by the life support machine, felt immense, suffocating. She buried her face in her hands, her carefully constructed composure finally crumbling. The cold, precise fury that had guided her in the restaurant was gone, replaced by a raw, aching despair. She had stood up to a giant, and the giant had swatted her away like an insignificant fly. He would go on to his next billion-dollar deal, his next lavish dinner, while she was left to pick up the pieces of her broken life. For a moment she allowed herself to truly feel the hopelessness of it all. She was blind, unemployed, and responsible for a sick man in a city that had no mercy for the weak. The fight seemed impossible, the odds insurmountable. The darkness behind her eyes had never felt so complete, so absolute. But as she sat there in the quiet dark, something Sterling had said during his tirade began to echo in her mind. It was a detail she had cataloged but not yet processed. In his rage, while demanding her termination, he had spat the name of the company he had so-called saved as an example of his business acumen. He had mentioned turning around the portfolio of Sterling Chemical Solutions. Sterling Chemical Solutions. The name struck her with the force of a physical blow, a lightning strike that illuminated the entire landscape of her past. It was the company that had owned the plant, the company that had issued the press releases filled with lies, the company that had offered a pittance of a settlement in exchange for a lifetime of silence. It was all connected. The arrogant man in the restaurant was not just a random monster, he was her monster. He was the architect of her darkness, the author of her father's suffering. A new energy surged through her, a current so powerful it pushed back the tide of despair. The grief and fear did not disappear, but they were transmuted, reforged in the fires of this revelation into something else entirely. It was no longer about a personal insult at a dinner table. It was not about a lost job. This was about justice, on a scale she had not dared to contemplate before. The cold, controlled fury returned, but this time it was different. It was not the reactive anger of a moment. It was the deep, abiding purpose of a lifetime. He had underestimated her in the restaurant, seeing only a blind waitress. He had no idea that in his arrogance, he had just handed her the one piece of information she needed to become his reckoning. He thought he had fired a servant. He had no idea he had just declared war on a lawyer. Her resolve solidified into a diamond, hard and clear. She would not be a victim. She would not let him win. She stood up from the bed, her movements now infused with a new, unshakable purpose. She navigated the familiar space of her room, her hands finding the dusty cardboard box tucked away under her bed. It was full of her old life, textbooks on tort law, binders filled with notes from her evidence classes, and her meticulously organized files from the mock trial team. The scent of aging paper filled her nostrils, the smell of a dream she had been forced to abandon. But it was not a dream anymore. It was an arsenal. She ran her fingers over the embossed titles of the books, the braille labels she had painstakingly added to her files after the accident. Everything she had learned, everything she had been, was still here, waiting. The skills had not vanished, they had only been dormant. Her first thought was of him, Professor Alistair Finch. Her mentor at law school, a man who believed the law was not just a profession, but a calling. He was a champion of the underdog, a brilliant legal mind who had dedicated his career to public interest law, fighting corporations just like Blackwood Capital. He had been devastated when she'd had to drop out, telling her that the legal world had lost one of its most promising future advocates. She hadn't spoken to him in years, embarrassed by her circumstances, feeling like a failure, but now that shame was a luxury she could not afford. He was the only person she knew with the resources, the knowledge, and the moral conviction to help her. She needed an ally, a guide to navigate the treacherous legal waters she was about to enter. He was her only hope. She found her old, outdated smartphone, her fingers flying across the screen with practiced ease, the voiceover software reading the contacts aloud. Her thumb hovered over his name for a long moment. A wave of doubt washed over her. Would he even remember her? Would he believe her incredible story? To the outside world, she was a disgraced waitress, accusing a powerful billionaire based on the sound of his voice. It was a preposterous claim, the kind of thing that would be dismissed as the ravings of a disgruntled employee. She took a deep breath, the hiss of her father's machine a steadying rhythm in the background. She had to try. She had to make him believe. Her entire plan, her entire quest for justice, depended on this single phone call. She pressed the screen, and the sound of the phone ringing filled the small, quiet room. After 3 rings that stretched into an eternity, a familiar voice answered, warm and slightly gravelly with age. Alistair Finch. Ilara's throat went dry. Professor Finch, she began, her voice barely a whisper. This is Ilara Vance. I was a student of yours. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought he wouldn't remember. Then, he spoke, his voice filled with genuine warmth and surprise. Ilara. Of course, I remember you. My star pupil. How are you? The simple, kind recognition was enough to break down the wall of her fear. The words came pouring out of her, a torrent of emotion and information. She told him everything. About the restaurant, about her heightened hearing, about Sterling Blackwood's lies, and finally, about the name he had let slip, Sterling Chemical Solutions. She laid the entire story at his feet, her heart pounding with the hope that he would see the truth in it. Professor Finch listened without interruption, his silence a testament to his focus. When she finally finished, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the line was quiet for a long moment. Ilara's anxiety spiked. Had she sounded insane? Had she lost him? Then, he spoke, and his voice was devoid of skepticism. It was filled with a quiet, simmering anger. I believe you, Ilara, he said, the words a balm on her raw nerves. I always knew you had a gift for finding the truth. And I've followed Sterling Blackwood's career for years. He's a predator who wraps himself in the flag of philanthropy. What you've just described, it fits his pattern perfectly. The validation was so powerful, it almost brought her to her knees with relief. She was not alone in this fight anymore. She had a mentor, a partner, a believer. He told her to meet him at his office the next morning. His office, located in a modest building that housed a dozen other nonprofits, was the polar opposite of Ethelgard. It smelled of old paper, strong coffee, and righteous indignation. The space was cramped, overflowing with towering stacks of legal briefs and case files that threatened to collapse at any moment. It was a fortress of knowledge, a command center for the war against injustice. Professor Finch, a man with kind eyes and a will of iron, greeted her not with pity, but with respect. He treated her not as a former student or a victim, but as a colleague. For the first time in years, Ilara felt like she was home, back in the world where she belonged, the world of logic, evidence, and the relentless pursuit of truth. They spent the next several hours huddled over his large oak desk, a battle plan taking shape. Finch laid out the monumental challenge ahead of them. Blackwood was insulated by layers of wealth and the best lawyers money could buy. The official paper trail from the acquisition and subsequent safety cuts at the chemical plant would be a fortress, scrubbed clean of any direct culpability. Her testimony about his voice, while compelling, would be dismissed in a court of law as circumstantial and subjective. "We need something undeniable," Finch explained, his voice grim. "We need hard evidence. A document, a recording, an insider witness, something that ties Sterling Blackwood's hand directly to the decision that caused that explosion." The path forward was clear. They had to find a crack in Blackwood's impenetrable wall. Their investigation began not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of paper and the click of a keyboard. Finch used his access to legal and financial databases, pulling up every public filing related to Blackwood Capital's acquisition of Sterling Chemical Solutions. He read the dense, jargon-filled documents aloud, his voice a steady drone, while Ilara listened with an intensity that bordered on supernatural. She was searching for inconsistencies, for the hollow notes in the corporate language that she was so attuned to hearing. She used her memory of the conversations she had overheard at Ethelgard, the casual boasts and veiled threats of the financial elite, to guide their search, pointing Finch toward specific clauses and footnotes that seemed out of place, that carried the faint scent of deception. Days turned into a week, then two. They worked relentlessly, fueled by coffee and a shared sense of mission. They mapped out the corporate structure, traced the flow of money, and created a timeline of events leading up to the explosion. As Finch had predicted, the official records were a masterwork of plausible deniability. Every decision to cut safety budgets was signed by a mid-level manager, a fall guy who had long since been paid off and disappeared. Blackwood's name was nowhere near the incriminating documents. They hit a wall, a dead end paved with legal loopholes and corporate shell games. Frustration began to set in. It seemed Blackwood was truly untouchable, a ghost in his own machine, his crimes perfectly insulated from consequence. It was Ilara who saw the new path forward. If the paper trail was a dead end, they had to find a human trail. They needed to find someone on the inside, someone whose conscience might be heavier than their severance package. She shifted their research from corporate filings to people. She began compiling a list of every executive, manager, and board member who had worked at Sterling Chemical Solutions and had left the company within a year of the Blackwood acquisition. She was hunting for a ghost of her own, someone who had seen the truth and had been paid to forget it. She was looking for a single voice of dissent in a chorus of corporate complicity, believing that somewhere, someone had. The list they compiled was a ghost registry, a collection of names belonging to men who had been well paid to disappear from the corporate world. Professor Finch sat at his desk, the glow of the monitor illuminating the lines of exhaustion on his face, reading the names aloud one by one. Ilara sat opposite him, her posture perfectly still, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to the echoes of the past. Each name Finch read was followed by a brief summary, a multi-million-dollar severance package, a non-disclosure agreement as thick as a novel, and a new life started in some sun-drenched, anonymous corner of the world. They were the silent, complicit beneficiaries of Sterling Blackwood's crimes, their silence purchased with the blood money that should have gone to safety upgrades and victim compensation. The task felt like trying to hear a single whisper in the middle of a hurricane, a search for one conscience in a sea of calculated greed. The first few days of the hunt were a monotonous grind of dead ends and brick walls. They made calls to numbers that had long been disconnected. They sent carefully worded emails to addresses that bounced back, marked as inactive. Each failed attempt was a small, chipping blow against their hope. The men on their list had been chosen by Blackwood for their malleability, for their willingness to trade their integrity for a life of comfort. They had vanished from the public record, with an efficiency that spoke of expert legal maneuvering. Alara could feel Finch's frustration mounting, a subtle tension in his voice, the weary sigh that escaped his lips after each failed call. Yet, her own resolve did not waver. She knew, with an unshakable certainty, that a lie of this magnitude could not be perfectly contained. Somewhere, a seam was weak. Somewhere, a voice was waiting to crack. She had Finch reread the list, not just the names and figures, but the fine print of their departure packages. She was listening for an anomaly, a deviation from the pattern. The severances were all formulaic, a precise calculation based on salary and tenure, designed to look standard while being extraordinarily generous. Then, Finch read a name that broke the rhythm. Arthur Penhaligon, former vice president of operations. His departure was different. He hadn't taken a golden parachute. He had simply retired, citing, quote, personal health reasons, with only his standard pension. He hadn't moved to a tropical island or a gated community in Florida. The last known address was for a small rural town in upstate New York, a place known more for its dairy farms than for housing retired executives. It was a dissonant note in Blackwood's carefully composed symphony of silence. "This is the one," Alara said, her voice quiet but firm. Finch looked up from the screen, his expression a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "Why him?" he asked. He took the smallest package. "He's the least likely to have incriminating evidence," Alara shook her head. "Men like Blackwood don't let loose ends exist," she explained, her legal mind kicking into high gear. "They overpay for silence because they can't risk leaving anything to chance." The fact that Penhaligon didn't get a massive payout means one of two things. Either he knew nothing, or he knew everything, and refused to be bought. A man who refuses a fortune to keep his mouth shut is a man with a conscience. And a conscience, she knew, was the heaviest burden of all. It was the crack in the wall they had been searching for. The drive upstate was a journey into a different world. The oppressive, chaotic noise of the city slowly faded, replaced by the gentle hum of the car's engine and the vast, open soundscape of the countryside. Alara kept her window cracked, letting the air, thick with the scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, wash over her. She could hear the rustle of leaves in unseen trees, the call of a bird high overhead, the rhythmic creak of a windmill turning slowly in the breeze. It was a world of natural, honest sounds, a stark contrast to the artificial, deceptive acoustics of Aethelgard. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel a pang of longing for a life this simple, a life untouched by the poison of Sterling Blackwood's ambition. But the steady, labored sound of her father's breathing, a memory that was never far from her mind, quickly snuffed out the thought. Simplicity was a luxury she had not been afforded. Professor Finch drove in a comfortable silence, sensing her need for reflection. He was more than a mentor now. He was a co-conspirator, a partner in this righteous quest. He broke the silence only once, his voice gentle. "Are you prepared for this, Alara? For what he might say? Or what he might not?" She turned her head from the window, facing him. "I'm prepared to listen," she replied. "That's all I can do. But I can hear the weight of a secret in a man's voice from 100 paces. Arthur Penhaligon has been carrying this one for years. I won't hear what he says. I'll hear what the secret has done to him." Her confidence was not born of arrogance, but of a deep, profound understanding of her unique gift. She was not going there to interrogate him. She was going there to hear his confession, whether he chose to speak it or not. Arthur Penhaligon's house was a modest gray-shingled cottage, set back from a quiet country road. A thin plume of smoke curled from its stone chimney, the only sign of life. As they walked up the gravel path, the crunch of their footsteps sounded unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. Finch knocked on the heavy wooden door, and they waited. Alara focused her hearing, listening past the door. She heard the faint sound of a television, then the creak of a floorboard, the shuffling of feet, and finally, a sharp intake of breath as someone peered through the peephole. The silence that followed was heavy with suspicion and fear. She knew he had seen Finch, an older gentleman in a suit, and immediately assumed the worst. He thought Blackwood had sent someone. When the door finally opened a crack, the man who stood there was a ghost of the executive from the files. Arthur Penhaligon was thin and stooped, his face a roadmap of worry, his eyes darting nervously between Finch and the empty space where Alara stood. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for a decade. Before Finch could even introduce himself, Penhaligon spoke, his voice a dry rasp. "I have nothing to say to you. I don't know who you are or who sent you, but you're wasting your time." He tried to close the door, but Finch, anticipating the move, placed a firm hand on it. "Mr. Penhaligon, we aren't from Blackwood Capital. My name is Alistair Finch, and this is Alara Vance. We just want to ask you a few questions about the explosion at the Sterling chemical plant." At the mention of the plant, a visible tremor ran through Penhaligon's body. Alara heard his heart rate spike, a frantic, panicked flutter against his ribs. His denial was immediate and forceful, but she heard the lie beneath it, the hollow, brittle foundation of his words. "I don't know anything about that. That was a long time ago. I was already retired. It was a terrible tragedy, but it had nothing to do with me." He was reciting a script, one he had likely practiced in the mirror 1,000 times, a mantra to ward off the guilt that haunted his waking moments. But his voice betrayed him. It lacked the resonant frequency of truth. It was the voice of a man desperately trying to convince himself, not his visitors. Finch began to press him with facts, citing dates and company memos, but Penhaligon's defenses only hardened. He was a cornered animal, lashing out with denials and threats to call the police. Alara knew this approach would fail. Logic and evidence were useless against a wall of pure terror. She held up a hand, a silent signal for Finch to stop. Then she took a half-step forward, her presence gentle but undeniable. "Mr. Penhaligon," she said, her voice soft, devoid of accusation. "I'm not here to talk about memos or corporate policy. I'm here to talk about my father. He worked at that plant for 30 years. He used to have a laugh that could make the windows rattle. Now the only sound he makes is the hiss of the oxygen machine that keeps him alive." She let the silence hang in the air, allowing the weight of her words to settle. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She simply painted a picture with sound, a portrait of the human cost of his silence. "When I was a little girl, my father would come home from the plant smelling of chemicals and hard work, and he would lift me up in his arms. I remember the sound of his breathing then. It was strong, steady, like the engine of the world. Now, I sit by his bed at night and listen to his lungs struggle for every breath. It's a thin, rattling sound, Mr. Penhaligon, like paper tearing. And I know, just as you know, that it was not a tragedy. It was a choice. A choice made on a conference call." The effect on Arthur Penhaligon was devastating. A choked sob escaped his throat, a sound of such profound, pent-up grief that it seemed to tear its way out of him. The wall of denial he had so carefully constructed over the years crumbled into dust. He stumbled back from the doorway, pulling the door wide open in a gesture of complete surrender. He sank into a worn armchair by the fireplace, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. Alara and Finch stepped inside, closing the door behind them, giving the broken man a moment to release the poison he had held inside for so long. The only sound in the room was the crackle of the fire and the sound of a decade of guilt finally being set free. When he could finally speak, the story came pouring out of him, a torrent of confession. He told them about the pressure from Blackwood, the relentless demands to cut costs and boost profit margins at any price. He described his own protests, how he had warned them, begged them, presenting safety reports and risk assessments that were all dismissed with a wave of a hand. He was a man of science and procedure, a believer in safety protocols, and he had been systematically overruled by a man who saw only numbers on a spreadsheet. His career, his principles, his very identity had been dismantled piece by Sterling Blackwood's insatiable greed. He had been powerless, a lone voice of caution drowned out by the roar of ambition. He confirmed Elara's suspicion. The final decision had been made on a conference call. Blackwood, furious about a dip in the projected resale value of the company, had been on a rampage. Penhaligon had made one last, desperate plea to reinstate the funding for critical maintenance on the primary chemical storage tanks. He remembered Blackwood's exact words, seared into his memory like a brand. "I don't pay you to be safe, Arthur. I pay you to be profitable. Shut down the maintenance program and make the numbers work." The line had gone dead, and with it, any hope of preventing the inevitable. He had been given a direct order, a command that he knew would lead to disaster. But then he revealed something more, something that made the hair on Elara's arms stand on end. He hadn't just remembered the words, he had recorded them. It was an old habit from his early days as an engineer, a way to ensure he never missed a technical detail. He had a small microcassette recorder that he kept in his desk drawer, and on that day, driven by a premonition of pure dread, he had switched it on before the call began. He hadn't done it as a weapon, but as a shield, a private record of his own descent. After the explosion, paralyzed by fear of Blackwood's retribution, and suffocated by his own guilt, he had hidden the tape away, unable to listen to it, but unwilling to destroy it. It was his sin, his penance, locked away in a box for 10 years. He led them to a small, locked safe hidden behind a painting of a tranquil seascape. His hands trembled as he worked the combination. He pulled out a small, dusty box and opened it. Inside, nestled in yellowed cotton, was a single microcassette tape. "This is it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "This is the proof." He handed the small plastic object to Finch, his hand shaking so badly that the tape rattled. It felt as if he were handing over his own soul. In that moment, he was no longer a coward hiding from his past. He was a witness, finally ready to testify. The weight of the tiny object in Finch's hand was immeasurable. It was not just a recording. It was a key, a weapon, the undeniable, irrefutable truth that would finally bring Sterling Blackwood to justice. Back in the city, the atmosphere in Finch's office was electric. They had the smoking gun. The first step was to preserve the evidence. Finch called in a trusted audio forensics expert, a woman who worked with the DA's office who carefully digitized the fragile tape. They sat in her soundproof studio, listening as she worked her magic, filtering out the background hiss and static of the old recording. And then, it played. Sterling Blackwood's voice, clear as a bell, filled the room. It was the same arrogant, dismissive baritone Elara remembered from the restaurant. But this time, it was not weaving a self-aggrandizing lie. It was cold, ruthless, and utterly damning. "Shut down the maintenance program and make the numbers work." The words hung in the air, a death sentence delivered, with the casual indifference of a man ordering lunch. With the evidence secure, the second phase of their plan began, choosing the battlefield. A quiet leak to the press would be damaging, but Blackwood's army of lawyers would spin it, bury it, and sue the newspaper into oblivion. A civil lawsuit would take years, a slow grind through a system designed to favor the wealthy. They needed something more immediate, more public, more devastating. They needed to engineer a moment of pure, undeniable catharsis, a public execution of his reputation from which he could never recover. It was Elara who found the perfect stage. While scanning the financial news, her text-to-speech software read an announcement that made her blood run cold, and then hot with purpose. Sterling Blackwood was scheduled to be the keynote speaker at the annual Ethical Investment Summit. The irony was so profound it was almost poetic. The man who had built an empire on lies, exploitation, and criminal negligence was going to stand before the world and lecture them on corporate responsibility. He was going to wrap himself in the very virtues he had so thoroughly desecrated. It was the ultimate act of hubris, and it would be his downfall. This was their venue. Not a courtroom, where lawyers could argue and obfuscate, but a court of public opinion, where the truth when revealed with enough force and clarity, could be absolute. They would use his own platform, his own moment of triumph, to utterly destroy him. The plan was audacious, risky, and perfect. The next week was a whirlwind of meticulous preparation. Professor Finch, using his considerable network of contacts in the legal and activist communities, secured a press pass for Ilara under the guise of a freelance journalist writing a piece on corporate ethics. They knew she would be granted one question during the Q&A session following Blackwood's speech. One question was all she would need. They didn't write a script for her. Instead, they focused on the evidence, preparing a simple but powerful presentation. It consisted of a single slide containing a high-resolution photograph of the chemical plant before the explosion, a list of the names of the 27 workers who were permanently injured, including her father, and a scrolling transcript of the damning audio they were about to play. Ilara spent her hours not memorizing lines but stealing her mind. She listened to the recording of Blackwood's voice over and over again, not to fuel her anger but to neutralize it. She needed to be calm, precise, and unshakable. She needed to be the voice of justice, not the voice of vengeance. She practiced her breathing, slowing her heart rate, finding the same cold, clear center of focus she had discovered in the restaurant. She was no longer the frightened girl who had lost her sight. She was no longer the desperate waitress struggling to pay the bills. She was the culmination of her past, a lawyer armed with a unique weapon, a daughter ready to fight for her father's honor. She was the truth, and she was coming for Sterling Blackwood. The morning of the summit arrived, a crisp, clear autumn day. The event was held in the grand ballroom of a five-star hotel, a room that dripped with the same kind of opulent excess as Æthelgard. The air smelled of expensive coffee and ambition. The sound was a low, powerful hum of hundreds of conversations, the collective murmur of the financial elite. Finch walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on her elbow, a silent, steadying presence. He guided her through the throng of reporters, executives, and investors, his voice a low murmur in her ear, describing the scene, painting a picture of the battlefield. They were a small, two-person army, armed with a single cassette tape and an unshakable belief in the truth, marching into the heart of the enemy's fortress. As they took their seats in the designated press area, Ilara could hear Sterling Blackwood's voice from the backstage area, amplified by a microphone check. The sound, once a trigger for her pain and anger, now did something else. It focused her. It was the sound of her target. The master of ceremonies began his introduction, his voice booming through the ballroom's state-of-the-art sound system, listing Blackwood's fictitious accomplishments and philanthropic endeavors. A wave of polite applause filled the room. Ilara took a slow, deep breath, the hiss of her father's oxygen machine a distant, motivating echo in her mind. The lights dimmed. A single spotlight hit the center of the stage. The moment was here. The final confrontation was about to begin. Sterling Blackwood, oblivious and arrogant, walked into the light, ready to perform. He had no idea he was walking to his own execution. Sterling Blackwood stood at the podium, bathed in the warm, forgiving glow of a single spotlight, a modern-day messiah preaching the gospel of ethical capitalism. The applause that followed his final, hollow platitude was a wave of polite, conditioned sound, the soft patter of 1,000 well-manicured hands that had never known a day of real labor. To Ilara, sitting in the designated press section with Professor Finch at her side, it sounded like rain on a tin roof, a meaningless noise that did nothing to wash away the filth beneath. She could feel the vibrations of the applause through the floor, a low thrum that traveled up her legs and settled in her chest. Her own heart was a steady, slow drum, a counter-rhythm to the room's manufactured enthusiasm. In her hand, she clutched the small, cool cylinder of the wireless microphone that a staff member had just passed to her. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with the years of her father's suffering, with the silence of all the other families broken by this man's greed. She took a slow, deliberate breath, and in her mind, she did not hear the applause. She heard the rhythmic hiss and click of the oxygen machine, the sound that had become both her torment and her North Star. It was the sound of her purpose. The moderator, a man with a voice as smooth and empty as polished glass, stepped up to the lectern. "We have time for a few questions from the press." He scanned the sea of raised hands and pointed directly into their section, his gaze landing on the blind woman with the microphone. A choice likely made for the optics of inclusivity. Ilara felt Professor Finch give her elbow a gentle, encouraging squeeze. This was it. She rose from her seat, her movements fluid and unhurried. The rustle of her clothing was the only sound she made as a new spotlight found her, painting her in the same warm, theatrical light as her adversary. A hush fell over the grand ballroom, an expectant silence filled with the faint scent of coffee and corporate perfume. Sterling Blackwood watched her from the stage, a benevolent, patronizing smile fixed on his face, the look of a king prepared to dispense a moment of his valuable time to a commoner. He saw a prop, a symbol of his own magnanimity. He had no idea he was looking at the face of his own judgment, the final witness for the prosecution in a trial that had been 10 years in the making. She raised the microphone to her lips, the cool metal a grounding presence. Her voice, when it came, did not carry the tremor of fear or the heat of anger. It was calm, clear, and resonated with an authority that instantly seized the attention of every person in the room, cutting through the opulent atmosphere like a shard of ice. "This isn't a question, Mr. Blackwood, it's a clarification. My name is Ilara Vance." The name meant nothing to him, but the sound of her voice, that precise, level tone, struck a chord of unwelcome familiarity. Ilara could hear the subtle change in his posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of the muscles in his neck. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She continued, her words measured, each one a carefully placed stone on the path to his ruin. 10 years ago, you made a decision on a conference call regarding the maintenance budget for the primary chemical storage tanks at a company you had just acquired. You were advised that cutting the budget would lead to a catastrophic failure. I was wondering if you could remind this room, this summit, on ethical investment, what your exact words were in response to that warning. The silence that followed was a living entity, a vast, suffocating pressure that filled every corner of the ballroom. Sterling Blackwood's face, projected onto the massive screens flanking the stage, was a mask of confusion, but Ilara heard the truth beneath it. She heard the sudden, sharp intake of his breath, the frantic acceleration of his heart, a panicked drumbeat that was a confession in itself. He opened his mouth to speak, to issue a denial, to call for security, but no sound came out. He was a predator caught in a trap he didn't even know had been set. And into that perfect, damning silence, Ilara spoke one final sentence. Or, perhaps it would be easier if I just played it for you. With a small, deliberate movement, she pressed a button on a small device in her other hand. A faint click echoed through the sound system, and then his own voice, stripped of its philanthropic varnish, filled the vast hall. A ghost from a decade past come to claim its due. "I don't pay you to be safe, Arthur. I pay you to be profitable. Shut down the maintenance program and make the numbers work." The words, cold, ruthless, and undeniably his, hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The effect was instantaneous and cataclysmic, a collective gasp. A sound of 1,000 lungs contracting at once swept through the audience. On the screens, Sterling Blackwood's face had gone slack, the blood draining from it, leaving a pale, waxy sheen of pure terror. Before the shock could even begin to settle, a new image flashed onto the screens, replacing his horrified face. It was a photograph of the chemical plant, vibrant and whole, followed by a scrolling list of 27 names, the names of the men, including her father, whose lives had been permanently shattered. The final piece of the presentation was the scrolling transcript of the audio they had just heard, a confession in black and white for the entire world to see. A low, angry murmur began to ripple through the ballroom, the sound of 1,000 private judgments coalescing into a single, unified wave of condemnation. The applause was a distant memory, replaced by the sound of a reputation being torn to shreds in real time. Sterling Blackwood stood frozen for a moment that stretched into an eternity, a statue of hubris crumbling under the weight of its own sins. He tried to speak, to form a defense, but his voice, his greatest tool of deception, failed him. He stammered, producing only a dry, croaking sound that was broadcast to the entire room. Ilara could hear the lie trying to form in his throat, the frantic, desperate contraction of his vocal cords. But the truth had him by the throat and would not let go. He looked out at the sea of faces, faces that had been full of admiration just moments before, and saw only contempt. His allies, the men who had clapped him on the back, were now edging away from him, their chairs scraping on the polished floor as they created physical distance from his toxicity. The flash of cameras began to erupt from the press section, a barrage of strobe lights capturing his complete and utter unraveling. He stumbled backward, away from the podium, away from the light, a man utterly and irrevocably broken, exposed not just as a liar, but as a monster. Type "justice" in the comments if you got chills when Ilara Vance finally exposed the truth. The fallout was immediate and absolute. Before Sterling Blackwood had even been escorted from the stage by a bewildered security team, the investors from the restaurant, who were in attendance at the summit, had their press agents release a statement publicly withdrawing from all ventures associated with him. The news hit the wire services instantly, and by the time the market opened the next day, Blackwood Capital stock was in a freefall from which it would never recover. The audio recording, now viral, was a catalyst for a full-scale federal investigation. Arthur Penhaligon, his conscience finally clear, became their star witness. The fortress of wealth and power that Sterling had built over a lifetime of cruelty was dismantled in a matter of weeks, its foundations rotted through by the lie he thought was long buried. He was left with nothing but financial ruin, a litany of criminal charges, and the inescapable echo of his own damning words. In the midst of the storm she had created, Ilara received a call. It was from the CEO of a rival investment firm, a woman who had been in the front row at the summit. She didn't offer condolences or congratulations. She offered Ilara a job. "We spend millions on due diligence, on background checks and forensic accounting," she had said, her voice filled with a genuine, unvarnished respect. "But we don't have anyone who can do what you can do. We don't have anyone who can listen for the truth." She offered Ilara a position as the head of a new corporate accountability division, a role created specifically for her, with a salary that was more than she had ever dared to dream of, and the resources to ensure that men like Sterling Blackwood would never be able to hide their crimes behind polished annual reports again. Her unique skill, born from tragedy, was finally seen not as a limitation, but as an unparalleled strength. She was no longer a waitress. She was a gatekeeper, a guardian against the very darkness that had tried to consume her. With her new resources, she was able to move her father out of their cramped apartment and into a small, comfortable house with a garden, where he could sit in the sun and breathe the clean air. She hired the best respiratory specialists, and for the first time in a decade, the rattling in his chest began to subside. One afternoon, as she sat with him on the porch, he did something she thought she would never hear again. He laughed. It was not the window-rattling boom of his youth, but it was a true, genuine laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, a symphony of victory and resilience that washed away the last, lingering shadows of their past. In that moment, she knew her fight had not just been for justice, it had been for this, for the return of a single priceless sound, for the restoration of a life that had been so cruelly diminished. Her quest was complete, the silence of their suffering finally broken by the sound of happiness. Ilara Vance became a legend in the world of finance, not for the money she made, but for the disasters she prevented. She was the silent guardian, the woman who could hear a lie through a boardroom wall, who could discern the truth in the tremor of a CEO's voice during a shareholder call. She used her power not for vengeance, but for protection, ensuring that the human cost of business was never again relegated to a footnote on a balance sheet. She had walked through the darkest valley, a world without light, and had emerged with a perception more profound than sight itself. Her journey proved that the greatest strength can be forged in the deepest wounds, and that dignity armed with the truth is a force more powerful than any fortune. She had stood up to a titan, not with a sword, but with a whisper of truth, and had brought his entire corrupt world crashing down around him, reminding everyone that those who are underestimated are often the ones who change the world. If Ilara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.